Hello and welcome to week 4 of our weekly piano proficiency videos. Today we're going to still be in the major scales, but we will be venturing into the black note scales. Alright, these are some alternative fingers, although in the long run these scales will ultimately be easier, especially when we get into 2-octave scales. So we'll be seeing G flat major today and D flat major. Remember, as you can see on this outline, both of those scales, remember from last time, are on the bottom of the circle. They're one of the bottom 3. So although they have a lot of black notes involved, they're actually very easy, and we'll go over that again. I'm actually gonna, now that we're introducing new finger patterns, I'll give you a 1-page finger pattern guide so that you can look up any scale without having to flip through multiple pages of diagrams and whatnot. And then we will look at melody, another little classical piece where we will do our harmonic analysis, and we will also take a look at a few things such as dynamics and articulations within that piece. Alright, but without further ado, let's head on over to the drum and do our rhythm warm-up. Alright, week 4 rhythmic warm-up, here we go. We're going to start at the first line. We're going to have our metronome at 40 BPM, and it is going to represent the downbeats. So here we go, I'll get the metronome started. We're going to start with our right hand on the rhythmic line and our left hand on the quarter note line. 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, 4, and 1, and 2, and 3. Switch your hands. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, 4, and 1, and 2, and 3. Top line hands together. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, 4, and. Okay, let's move on to line 2. I'm going to move the metronome up to 45 BPM, and now we are going to imagine that these clicks are on the upbeats. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. 1, and 2, 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and switch your hands. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. 1, and 2, 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and hands together. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. 1, and 2, 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. Excellent. All right. Now we're going to move up to 50 BPM, but we're going to put the metronome on half time. So for line 3, we're going to actually put the metronome on 25 BPM. And we're going to hear these clicks on the first and third downbeats. All right, so it's going to go like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and switch hands. 1 and 2 and 3, 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3, 4 and 1, 2 and 3 and top line 1 and 2 and 3, 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2 and 3, 4 and 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and. There we go. All right, we're almost done here. We're going to do one more line. We're going to speed the metronome up to 60 BPM, but remember it's on half time, so we're actually putting it at 30 BPM. And now we're going to imagine that these clicks are on the second and the fourth downbeat. All right, here we go. 1, 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3, 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1, 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3, switch hands 1 and 2 and 3, 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1, 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3, hands together 1 and 2 and 3, 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1, 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3, 4. There we go. That's our week 4 rhythm warm-up, and now back to the piano. All right, welcome back to the piano. Today we're going to talk about two new scales, G flat major and D flat major. Now that we're entering the flat scales, we are going to be using some different finger patterns, all right? And so let's go ahead and talk about G flat major. And before we actually talk about playing it, we're going to take a look at it on the circle of fifths. So if we remember from B, the fifth note of B major, B, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp. So the fifth note of B is F sharp, but we are going to switch over to the flats now, so we're going to start calling that G flat. Now that doesn't mean that you can't continue in sharps, but if you want to start taking accidentals away as we approach C again, then we switch to flats. If we continued with sharps, it would get a little funky. We'd have to continue adding sharps, even adding some double sharps. But remember, the most important thing is it really doesn't matter what you call these notes and scales, because the most important thing is that you remember the shape of the scale on the keyboard. Okay? If you can remember that core concept of the shape of the scale, then it doesn't matter what you see it written as or what someone is calling it. And you will hear people say and refer to these scales in many different ways. But if you have that core shape in your memory, then you'll always be able to access it. Now, speaking of the core shape, remember I left the reminder up on the bottom of the circle from last week. D flat, G flat, and B are all very easy because they use all 5 black keys, which are all sticking up for you to see, and you only have to remember 2 white keys, all right? So let's go ahead and take a look at the flats of G flat, okay? Now it does have quite a few. It's gonna have all of the flats. And so we're going to have a B flat, an E flat, an A flat, D flat, G flat, of course, and then finally C flat, which is a little weird, and we'll talk about why we have a C flat in just a moment, all right? Now, one thing that you can notice is that the order of the flats is actually the reverse of the order of the sharps, right? If we were to add one more flat to that, it would be F flat, and so then we would have the F, C, G, D, A, E, B, right? But when we reverse it, we get the order of the flats, which is actually kind of easy to remember because it spells out the word bead, B-E-A-D, and then G-C-F. All right, a little fun trivia for you. So let's take a look now at the G flat major. All right, so why do we have C flat? Well, whenever we are writing out a scale, the very first thing we do before we add any accidentals is we simply write every letter from that letter to that letter. In this case, we would write every note from G to G. All right, we'd have G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Then we would go and we would look at our circle and we would add those flats in, right? Now here's the thing. If we were to call this C flat, if we were to call that B, because technically it is a B, right? If we were to call that a B, then we would have a B and we would have a B flat, and therefore we would not have one of every letter in the scale. So it's a little weird calling it a C flat. I honestly have no problem calling it a B, because remember, it doesn't matter what you call these notes. What matters is that you remember the shape of the scale on the keys, all right? Now, we are going to have 2 lifts, all right? We've been dealing with 1 lift per scale, but now we're gonna have 1, 2 lifts. So actually, basically 3 positions, all right? So let's go ahead and take a look at this on the piano. So the way that I like to look at G flat is to think about it as 3 different hand positions with 2 lifts, all right? The first hand position is right here, these 3 notes. Then the second hand position, you would lift your hand up and you would put it right here. And then the last hand position would be right here. So this is a good way to practice it if you are having a little trouble with this concept at first, is to just block these notes. It doesn't sound great, but it can get your visual memory going. And once you're comfortable with that, we can play it 1 note at a time. Fantastic. Now let's take a look at the left hand, all right? In this case, we have our first shape, our second shape, and then our third shape is very easy, 1 single finger. The blocking, all right? So we're gonna go all right, now practice that hand separately as many times as you need to, but then we're going to want to try nice and easy to put it hands together. There we go, easy peasy. Now let's take a look at D flat major, okay? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to add its flats to the circle. So let's come over here to D flat. And now this is going to be very easy. It's just going to be the process of elimination. So we'll keep all of the flats that we had in our G flat scale, but we'll leave off the last one. All right, so there's no C flat in the key of D flat. All right, very simple. If we look at the table, remember we have all of our notes from D to E, D to D, we have D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, and then we just went in and added those flats. No weird flats, we just have a regular F and a regular C. Let's go ahead and take a look at this scale on the keyboard, all right? Now just like with with D flat, you can do your blocking with this scale also, all right? So if I were to block this scale, it would look like this. Doesn't sound great, but it's very helpful. And then when I were to play it with my right hand, it would go like this. Let's take a look at the blocking with the left hand. Right? And then if you were to play that note by note, and then hands together. Now, one last thing to take a look at before we move on is I want you to notice how every time you lift, it's almost always going to be done with your fourth or your third finger. We lifted here, we went with the fourth. Here we have a 3. We lifted to the third. Same down here, we had our third. We had a 1 and a 4, 1 and a 3. So this is going to really come in handy when you are trying to put hands together. You know, you're not going to have to think, am I crossing with my second finger? Am I crossing with my pinky? No, it's usually going to be your third or your fourth finger, all right? Now, one thing that I did promise you is that I'll give you all of the scales. So here is our scales guide, all right? It has all of the scales on this row here, or I should say column. We have our 1 octave fingerings on this column, and our 2 octave fingerings, when we get there, will be in that column. Now you can see our first 5 scales are using the same finger patterns, right? And then the last column that I want to talk to you about was the finger type, right? Because as you may have noticed, one thing I like to do is lump information together. Instead of saying, oh, I need to remember all these black keys down at the bottom. Well, guess what? It's actually just 2 white keys, things like that. Well, instead of thinking, well, oh man, I've got all of these different finger patterns I have to remember. Well, what I've done here is I've figured out which finger patterns are exactly the same. So this uses the right hand 1 pattern and the left hand 1 pattern. Notice how B still uses the right hand 1 pattern, but then it uses an alternative left hand pattern. Same with F. It uses the left hand 1 pattern and an alternative right hand pattern. Now, some of them are not exactly unique, which is why some of them have a decimal point, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. That's because I feel that some of these finger patterns are so similar that they may have 1 finger difference, and therefore we want to associate them as being related. So some of the scales are going to have very similar finger patterns, maybe just 1 finger difference. Anyways, this is a nice quick reference so that you don't have to page through all of these documents. Remember, you can purchase each of these documents associated with each lesson from my website, pianodojo.com. And now we're going to go ahead and move on to our sight reading. So here we have the song Melody. I want you to notice first and foremost that the thing that is different about this is that so far we've sort of had our left hand playing this boring accompaniment and our right hand having all the fun with the melody. But in this case, what we have is something called a monorhythmic song. That means there's 1 rhythm and both of those voices are playing in the same rhythm and they're harmonizing together, all right? So let's take a look at our key signature first, because we're going to do a harmonic analysis, right? We never want to just be putting our hands on black dots. We want to be seeing chords so that not only we understand better what we're doing, but also so that we can anticipate chords that are coming up and know what to play before we see it. So if we look at the key signature, we can see that we have 1 sharp, and the scale on the circle that has 1 sharp is right next to C major. That's the G major scale. So we're going to be analyzing this song in the key of G major. That means that our 1 chord is going to equal G, B, D, and our 5 chord is going to equal D, F sharp, and A. All right? Now, let's look at the first measure, and we can see that most of the beats, most of the chords in here are associated with the G major chord. We have G, B, D, B, and then there is a little bridge. These 2 notes that are bridging right here are passing between those chord notes, right? So because the majority of the notes and on the stronger beats are in the key of G, we're going to go ahead and give this a label of a 1. And we know that we have those passing notes. We're going to have the same thing going on in the second measure, where we have mostly G harmonies, and then we have just 2 quarter notes that are bridging the gap between those harmonies, so we'll continue calling that a 1, all right? Now in this next measure, we notice that the majority of the notes are, we have A, C, and D, right? Now this is another one of those ones that we talked about last time where the 5 is becoming a little bit more tense. We're adding a little bit more color to the 5. Instead of just that D, F sharp, A, we're also adding its T into it, and the T is flat. and therefore we call that a 5/7. All right? So there we're going to have our 5/7, and we know we can, without even looking, the 5/7 is so tense, it wants to resolve so much that it is going to collapse to that 1, so we can almost be sure that this is a 1. So melody is starting to look more like Carefree, where we had the gentle rise to the 5 and then a resolution. However, the only difference here is that, surprise, surprise, we actually have more than one chord in the last measure, and that is totally valid. You can have many harmonies per measure, and in this one, what has happened is a surprise ending. We've said the end, not really, right? Because when we hear that 5, whether or not you've ever had musical training, we've all grown up in a culture that uses these musical rules, and therefore when we hear a 5, we instinctively know that the song is not over. So we had that nice graceful flow, but then we have a surprise ending right there, making this piece of music more of a compound sentence instead of 2 complete sentences, right? Now the last line, just like most of these pieces, is going to continue on in just the same way, right? And then we're going to have our 5/7. However, in this one, as you would expect in the last measure, we're not going to have that surprise ending. We just have a nice solid 1, all right? So that's the harmony of melody. Let's take a look at playing it now. So we're in the key of G, so we're going to want to set our right hand up on the G position, the first 5 notes of G, above middle C. All right, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to play this starting with our 3rd finger on that B right there. So we're going to go up. Second measure, we're going to go down to our thumb. And then for the 3rd measure, we're going to go to our 2nd finger. Surprise, there's our 2nd finger getting to that 5 harmony. Now we're going to look at the next line, starting with our 3rd finger. 2nd measure down to our thumb. There we go. Now let's take a look at our left hand. So we're going to put this in the G major position below middle C. All right, and we're going to start with our pinky on the G. 2nd measure, we're going to pick up on our 3rd finger again, and then our 2nd finger on the C. Middle finger to the thumb. Hey, that's part of the chord right there, isn't it? Then we're going to go back down to our pinky. There we are. All right, now let's try to put this hands together. So it'll go something like this. There we have it. Now, unfortunately, on this keyboard and with this program I'm using, you can't really get the greatest dynamics in the world. All right, but I do want to talk about the dynamics because remember, the first thing we do is we learn our right hand, then we learn our left hand, then we put our hands together. But there's still one more layer. We want to be expressive, we want to be musical, so we want to add dynamics, and we also want to add articulations, all right? So as we can see, let's take a look at these dynamics. First of all, we're going to start this piece in forte, which means strong, right? Now, one thing that we can see at the very end is that we're actually going to have what's called a decrescendo, right? It's a pretty self-explanatory shape, but we want to taper off right there with our volume. And you can usually see an actual dynamic marking after that to tell you where it wants you to taper down to. And in this case, we're going to be tapering down to a mezzo piano where we will be for the next line. All right. Now we're going to continue tapering down for this piece because we have another decrescendo, and finally we're going to end up on a piano right there. Okay. So that is our dynamics. But what about articulations, okay? So we talked about dynamics last time, but we have not really talked about articulations, the way in which you play the note. Do you want to play it short? Do you want to play it nice and smooth and legato, right? things like that. So I'm going to draw your attention to these curves that are connecting these notes. And what those are asking you to do is to connect those notes in a nice smooth way, all right? We have those in both places, and in that case, we would want to play those notes legato. The last thing I'm going to show you is also a timing thing. We can notice that not only do we have a decrescendo, but we have what's called a rallentando, which is abbreviated RALL period, right? And the rallentando is a slight slowdown as you descend into that final one chord, right? So we've got dynamics here, we've got some legato articulations, we have decrescendos, and finally we have a rallentando at the very end of the piece. Okay, that's week 4. Very easy, right? We're just continuing on in this cycle now, and we won't have very much new material until we get to our chords in about 2 more lessons, all right? So remember, you can download all of these outlines, sheet music, guides, all of that from my website, pianodojo.com, and happy practicing. I'll see you next week.